In March of 1974, a 31-year-old Italian named Giacomo Agostini flew to Daytona Beach, Florida for the first time in his life. He was, at that point, the most successful motorcycle road racer in the history of the sport. 15 world championships, 68 Grand Prix wins. He had won every major race in Europe twice. The American Motorcyclists Association had finally convinced him to come race the Daytona 200, the biggest motorcycle race in the United States, on the Yamaha that the American Yamaha distributor had personally tested and prepared for him for 3 weeks. Agostini was the favorite. He was supposed to win. 48 laps into the race, his bike broke down. Mechanical failure, the fuel system. The American mechanics had set it up wrong. Agostini got off the bike on the side of the Daytona International Speedway, walked back to the pits in his racing leathers, and stood there for 10 minutes before he said anything. When he finally spoke, what he said in his thick Italian English was something that has stuck with me for 50 years. He said in essence that this was a beautiful race, but the people running it had not wanted him to win. I think most of you watching this video have never heard the Agostini story. I think the Agostini story is the exact moment Daytona Bike Week stopped being for bikers and started being for somebody else. 3 days ago, I uploaded a video on this channel called Sturgis Used to Be Real. 33,000 of you watched it in 72 hours. The comments were full of men in their 60s and 70s who had been to Sturgis in 1978, 1981, and 1985, telling me what it actually felt like, telling me when they stopped going, telling me what they saw it become. I read every one of those comments, and the same name kept coming up over and over again: Daytona. The men who used to ride to Sturgis told me they used to ride to Daytona too, and they do not go anymore. They have not gone in 25 years. Some of them have not gone in 40 years. So today I am going to do for Daytona what I did for Sturgis. I am going to tell you what it actually was, and I am going to tell you the specific years it stopped being that thing. Daytona Bike Week started in 1937, that is 1 year before Sturgis. Daytona is older. The first Daytona 200 was a beach race, run on the actual sand of Daytona Beach, with riders making a turn at the south end of the beach onto a paved highway and then back down the sand to complete the loop. Picture this for a second. You are standing on the beach in March 1937. The tide is going out. The course is 4.2 miles long, half of it on hard-packed wet sand at low tide, the other half on a 2-lane paved highway called A1A. There are wooden barricades. There is a man with a flag. There are no grandstands because they had not been invented for this kind of race yet. The riders are wearing leather helmets that look like football helmets from the same era, and goggles that fog up if it rains. The bikes are Indians and Harleys and the occasional British twin, and the prize money for first place is $100, which in 1937 was real money, but not enough to bring out anyone except the men who genuinely loved racing motorcycles. The first Daytona 200 was won by a man named Ed Kretz on an Indian Sport Scout. Ed Kretz had ridden his motorcycle from Pomona, California to Daytona, Florida to enter the race. He covered roughly 2,600 miles in 9 days, racing across the country in the wrong direction of weather, sleeping in roadside ditches, and eating at diners that no longer exist. When Kretz pulled into Daytona, he had 3 days to prepare his bike before the race. He won the race by a full lap. He cashed his $100 check and rode the same motorcycle back home to California. The total cost of his entire 1937 Daytona experience, including gas, food, and the entry fee, was roughly $47. He cleared $53 of profit. $53 in 1937 money was a month's rent in a Pomona boarding house. That is what the first Daytona Bike Week was. A man riding a motorcycle a long way to a race, winning, and going home. By 1948, the rally had grown. By 1961, the race had moved off the beach onto the new Daytona International Speedway, which was a bigger circuit, safer, with paved corners that nobody could lose on the sand by accident. And by 1974, the year Agostini came over, Daytona Bike Week was drawing roughly 70,000 riders to the city of Daytona Beach over a 10-day stretch in March. 70,000. That is the number to remember. Because last year, in 2024, Daytona Bike Week drew approximately 500,000 people. That is more than 7 times what it was in 1974. And almost none of those 500,000 people are riding their motorcycles into the city. They are arriving on trailers. They are arriving in rental cars. They are arriving on flights. The 1974 attendee was a man on a motorcycle who had ridden between 300 and 3,000 miles to get there. The 2024 attendee is, statistically, somebody who has flown into Orlando, rented an SUV, driven the 55 miles to Daytona, and walked Main Street looking at vendor booths. I personally think those are not the same event. I personally think calling them by the same name is the single biggest piece of marketing fraud in American motorcycle culture, and I personally think the men in my comments section last week were trying to tell me exactly that. Now let me give you the cheeseburger number, because the cheeseburger number is the number that does the work. In March of 1974, the going rate for a cheeseburger at the Boot Hill Saloon on Main Street, the most famous biker bar in Daytona for the entire 1970s and 1980s, was $1.75. The Boot Hill is still there in the same building. The cheeseburger on the menu last March, during 2024 Bike Week, was $26. You can tell me that everything has gotten more expensive since 1974, and you would be right. Cumulative inflation since 1974 is approximately 7.5 times. So, 1974 $1.75 cheeseburger should cost around $13 today. The Boot Hill cheeseburger is $26. That is a 100% markup over inflation. That is what they charge during Bike Week, specifically. The other 50 weeks of the year, the Boot Hill cheeseburger is $14. Same kitchen, same meat, same bun. A $12 Bike Week tax. Multiply that $12 markup across an estimated 40,000 Bike Week cheeseburgers sold at the Boot Hill alone over a 10-day stretch, and you have nearly $500,000 of pure rally margin extracted from one bar. I'm using one cheeseburger at one bar to illustrate a story about an entire city that has been fundamentally restructured around extracting the maximum possible dollar amount from a man wearing a leather jacket. The cheeseburger is the symptom. The disease is the city. And let me give you the rest of the price ladder, because the cheeseburger is just where it starts. A motel room 3 blocks off Main Street that costs $68 a night, the second week of February costs $420 a night during Bike Week. The same room, the same cleaning staff, the same parking lot. A vendor booth on Main Street, 12 feet wide, costs roughly $8,000 for the 10-day rally. That same booth in any other Florida tourist event costs around $700 for an equivalent stretch. The boardwalk parking lot that charges $3 an hour every weekend in October charges $30 per car per day during Bike Week, with no in and out privileges. A custom t-shirt that costs $8 to print, screen, and tag costs $45 at the booth. A patch costs $12. A leather vest, sized for a man who is going to wear it for 3 days and never put it on again, costs $350. The entire economic structure of Daytona Bike Week as it exists today is engineered to take the disposable income of a man who has been planning this trip for 2 years and convert it, line item by line item, into the operating revenue of corporate hospitality groups headquartered nowhere near Daytona Beach. I think every man who has paid a Bike Week price has felt that on some level, and the trade press will not say it out loud, because the trade press is paid for by the same advertisers running those booths. So, when did this happen? When did Daytona stop being a motorcycle rally and start being a tourism product engineered to look like a motorcycle rally? The honest answer, the answer that the Daytona Convention and Visitors Bureau will not give you, but that is documented in the city's own annual reports, if you go look, is that it happened between 1986 and 1990. 3 things happened in that 4-year window, and all 3 of them were corporate decisions by people who do not ride motorcycles. The first was that the Bike Week Welcome Center, a quasi-governmental tourism office, started selling official vendor licenses to large national companies for the first time. Before 1986, the vendors on Main Street were almost all local. They were Daytona area shops, Florida-based independent leather makers, regional swap meet operators. After 1986, you started seeing corporate booths from companies based in Los Angeles, Chicago, and New York. The local vendors got priced out. The leather guy who had been there since 1968 was told his booth fee was tripling and that he would need to compete in an open auction for his slot the following year. He did not bother, he retired. The second thing was that the city of Daytona, between 1987 and 1989, signed a long-term arrangement with International Speedway Corporation, the operator of the Daytona International Speedway, that quietly handed that one corporation effective control over the official Bike Week branding, the official Bike Week schedule, and the official Bike Week sponsor relationships. International Speedway Corporation was at that point being absorbed into the corporate empire of a man named Bill France Jr., who was building NASCAR into the entertainment property it is today. France was not a motorcycle rider. France was an empire builder. He saw a rally of 100,000 people in his backyard with no centralized commercial structure, and he saw an opportunity. The third thing, the thing nobody talks about, was that in 1990, the Boot Hill Saloon and 3 other major Main Street bars were all sold within an 18-month period to a holding group out of Tampa. The bars kept their names. They kept their look. The men behind the bar changed. The kitchen recipes changed. The cheeseburger went from local ground beef to a national food service contract. The same thing that happened to American chain restaurants between 1985 and 1995 happened to Daytona Bike Week's biker bars on a compressed timeline. Now I want to slow down and tell you about a fourth thing because it gets less attention, and I personally think it is the most damaging of all 4. Between 1991 and 1994, the Daytona Beach Police Department, the Volusia County Sheriff's Office, and the Florida Highway Patrol jointly developed what they internally called the Bike Week Enforcement Protocol. Parts of that document became public through Florida public records requests in the late 1990s, and it established that during the 10-day Bike Week stretch, the 3 agencies would coordinate to issue what one internal memo described as high-volume revenue traffic enforcement on the corridors leading into Daytona Beach. In practice, they quintupled the number of patrol units running Interstate 95 and Highway A1A during Bike Week. They built revenue projections into the city budget that assumed each rally would generate between $2 and $3 million in citation revenue alone. The men riding motorcycles to Bike Week were no longer customers, they were a revenue source. They were targets with wallets. I personally think most of you watching this who attended Bike Week between 1995 and 2010 already know exactly what I'm describing, because you got pulled over for something you would not have been pulled over for in your home state. The lane change without a turn signal, 2 miles an hour over the limit, an expired tag, loud pipes after dark. By the early 2000s, getting from Jacksonville to Daytona Beach on the Friday before Bike Week officially opened was a gauntlet of 3 to 5 separate police interactions for the average rider, and the citation revenue from those interactions was being banked into the city's general fund and used to subsidize the corporate vendor side of the rally. You were paying, in cash, for the privilege of being marketed to. I personally think that is why every Sturgis veteran who commented on my last video also told me they used to ride to Daytona. Daytona was the southern Sturgis. The Sturgis demographic was the same as the Daytona demographic. They were men aged 45 to 65, riding their own motorcycles to a place that felt unmodified by the people who were not there. And then both rallies got modified, the same way, by the same kind of corporate logic, in the same 5-year window. Sturgis bottomed out around 1995. Daytona bottomed out around 1990. The men who attended both rallies stopped going within 5 years of each other. Most of them never gave a public interview about why, they just stopped showing up. Let me give you the names of the people who would still remember 1974 Daytona if you put them on Main Street tomorrow. There was a leather shop on Atlantic Avenue run by a man whose name half of you watching probably remember if you rode in the 1970s or the 1980s. He turned down at least 3 buyout offers from a national chain because he said the men who came in his shop trusted him to know what he was selling them. He was 83 when he finally closed. He lived in Port Orange, 10 miles south of Daytona, and he had stopped attending Bike Week years before he closed his shop. He told a local reporter once that the men who came into his shop had stopped being the men he wanted to sell to. That was the year, he said, that he knew the rally was over for him. There was a working motorcycle repair shop on Beach Street that ran from 1962 to 2003. It was run by a man who let riders sleep on the shop floor during Bike Week if they had a mechanical problem they could not fix in time to ride home. He charged them whatever they could afford. Sometimes that was nothing. The shop is now a souvenir t-shirt store. There is the Iron Horse Saloon. It is technically still there, technically still on the route, but it is now owned by a Tampa hospitality group and bears almost no resemblance to the place it was in the 1970s when it was run by a Vietnam veteran who threw out anyone he did not like the look of. He sold in 1989. He told the local paper at the time that the rally had stopped being something he wanted to be a part of. He was 51 years old when he sold. He had built the bar from a beer and pool stick joint into a Bike Week landmark over 23 years. He drove to Tennessee after the sale and never came back to Daytona. The reporter who wrote the story said his last words were that this is not for me anymore. It is for tourists. And there was a diner. There is always a diner. The diner that mattered for Bike Week between 1968 and 1991 was a counter and stools place near the Speedway whose name half of you will remember if you ever ate there. The owner was a woman who had taken the place over from her father in 1962. She knew her regulars by their bike, not by their face, by their bike. She would see a 1971 Norton Commando pull up out front, and she would have the eggs over easy and the wheat toast on the counter before the rider had pulled his helmet off. She did this for hundreds of riders over 30 years. When the corporate consolidation hit Daytona, her landlord, who had been her landlord for 26 years at a fixed lease, sold the building to a national restaurant operator in 1992. The new owner doubled the rent. She closed the diner inside of 9 months. The building was torn down and replaced with a chain coffee shop. The riders who had eaten there for decades had nowhere to go for breakfast during Bike Week the following year. Most of them ate gas station hot dogs that year and never came back to Daytona for any year after that. I personally think the most honest description of what Daytona Bike Week is in 2026 is that it is a tourism product designed to extract maximum revenue from a demographic of men who feel a deep emotional pull toward an event that does not exist anymore. The motorcycle rally those men remember ended somewhere between 1989 and 1992. The product that has run on Main Street Daytona every March since then is a recreation, a simulation. The rentable Harleys are real Harleys. The vendor booths are real booths. The Main Street strip show bars are real bars. None of it adds up to the thing the men in my comment section keep telling me they remember. The thing they remember was a community of riders who had each other's backs because they had to, who knew the same mechanics, who slept on the beach for free, who ate at counter diners run by people whose names they knew, who paid $4 for a cheeseburger because that was what a cheeseburger cost, and who believed, without articulating it, that the rally belonged to them. That community got sold in pieces between 1986 and 1990 to corporate ownership groups based in Tampa, Charlotte, and New York. The community did not vote on the sale. The community was not asked. The community simply showed up at the rally one year, looked around, and said quietly to themselves, "This isn't ours anymore." Here is what nobody talks about. The riders who built Daytona Bike Week were the same generation of working-class American men who built every other piece of post-war American culture that has been dismantled and sold for parts since 1985. The men who rode their Triumphs and their Sportsters and their Honda 4s into Daytona in the 1970s were factory workers, Vietnam veterans, mechanics, electricians, longshoremen, iron workers, refrigeration repairmen, and machinists. They were the demographic that built the American middle class. They are also the demographic that has been most systematically priced out of every market that used to belong to them. Their houses, their dealerships, their bars, their rallies, their motorcycles, the same 40-year economic restructuring that turned their houses into rental properties for hedge funds, turned their motorcycle rallies into branded entertainment products for corporate tourists. And I personally think the saddest part of telling this story is that almost nobody in the trade press will say it in plain English, because saying it in plain English would offend the advertisers. So the men who built Daytona just quietly stopped going, and the trade press wrote about Bike Week as if it had always been what it became. So the question I want to leave you with, the same question I left at the end of my Sturgis video that so many of you answered honestly, is this: when did Daytona stop being real for you? What year? What specific moment? Was it the first time you paid more than $10 for a beer on Main Street? Was it the first time you saw a corporate booth where a leather shop you recognized used to be? Was it the year you noticed that more people were arriving on trailers than on motorcycles? Was it the year a state trooper pulled you over on Interstate 95 for nothing on the Friday morning before opening day? Was it 1990, 1995, 2000, 2005, or 2015? Drop your year and your story in the comments. I read every single one. I will reply to as many as I can in the next 48 hours, the same as I did with the Sturgis video. And I personally think the men who can still tell that story are the men this channel is for. Not for the people who fly into Orlando and rent an SUV. For the men who used to ride. The men who remember. The men who know exactly which year it stopped being theirs.